Sami, many thanks for agreeing to join me in a conversation which will mostly be centered around or talked through via the Benjamin in Palestine conference, which was a project that you initiated and which I attended 5 years ago. My topic of research is the interaction between curating theory and art in the fabric of artistic production. And my argument is that there should be a new conception or a reconception of old ideas about the relationship between aesthetics and art. And that project and you as a person are very exemplary for this question. You as a theoretician also engage very much in projects concerning art, of which also Benjamin in Palestine was a great example. So maybe first introduce you shortly, and then shortly go into the Benjamin in Palestine conference, what that was about. So maybe a little introduction about your persona.
Yeah, for me, as you already said, first of all, thanks for including me in the video and in your project. I remember well when you were there, it's 5 years ago. And yeah, as you said, I do Benjamin scholarship, mostly in the university, but I come from Marx and critical theory. So within the spectrum of Benjamin scholarship, I would probably be considered in the Marxian, not Marxist probably, but Marxian camp, whatever that means nowadays. But there's obviously a reason why I read Benjamin, why I'm interested in, which is beyond a la pour l'art, merely philologically interested angle. And I wouldn't say that we looked at something like activism within academia. Academia is anyways in a very sad condition nowadays. I think the neoliberalization of higher education finally came to a conclusion, or to its conclusive end, and those things were already visible earlier. So in Benjamin scholarship in university, off-site, off-campus, on-campus, I still think all of those years, 20-25 years, I remember that we always faced two factions. The business faction that is open to new ideas because they're neoliberals. Of course, they will invite new concepts and whatsoever. And you have the old, more, let's say, feudally organized scholarship, old style scholarship faction that actually did a lot of great research, by the way. So content-wise, they're interesting, but they try to seal off their little topic or their little whatever, their well-defined protected research area, and which is also problematic in a way, especially if you deal with figures broadly associated with critical theory or critical theory Frankfurt School. Benjamin, of course, is such a figure, or his oeuvre is, of course, situated exactly between whatever literary studies, art theory, media practice, media theory, philosophy for sure, politics, it all comes together. Yeah. And he was also denied entry into academia. So in Benjamin, of course, all those topics are already present, so you don't have to invent this a second time. So the constellation of influences is already there. I think my interest in Benjamin was also coming from that, let's say, or a transdisciplinary oeuvre in Benjamin and his various media in which he practiced. But coming back to your question, I mean, the idea for Benjamin in Palestine wasn't, first of all, not only my idea, it was a collective effort by a couple of scholars, activists, writers. Initially I did it with, I shared the idea with another Benjamin scholar, colleague, distinguished colleague of mine who is teaching nowadays in Canada, Paula Schwebel. And also initially we got a lot of support by Udi Aluni, filmmaker, also activist. And of course we had also an international team that supported us. We had a letter. We had a letter that was co-signed by various international critical theorists, among them also Judith Butler and Slavoj Žižek. So it was actually something that immediately grew very, very quickly. I think it was in 2014. And it was a reaction first towards a very depoliticizing or kind of merely scholarly attempt by some really well-known and also distinguished colleagues of mine whose work on Benjamin I really appreciate, to hold a conference in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv, which of course would have been beyond borders for anyone doing Benjamin scholarship in Palestine. So knowing the border and checkpoint situation, the situation in a state that occupies a territory which is not considered its state territory, of course made this a political move, even though those people who thought about this conference thought it might be an apolitical move. You know, every year, or every I think 2 years, the International Benjamin Society conference is at another place, which is totally legit. I mean, it's normal. But of course, imagine you would do something on Crimea and Ukraine. Of course, you would make a political. It would be a political stance, and if you were doing it with a Russian declared university only, probably the Ukrainian scholars, Benjamin scholarship would be a bit upset. So you can say it was a kind of I wouldn't say it was a naivete coming from Benjamin scholars particularly, but it's something that comes through institutional reasoning. It comes through Betrieb, the kind of academic way of dealing with things, which you may say is still surprising, because we are not talking about a apolitical figure. So in a way, it was still surprising that this could be done with and through Benjamin. So that is actually kind of weird. But anyways, this was one thing, and I had the idea. Anyways, I'm half Palestinian, and it was the idea. Also, I wanted to travel again. I was there many times before. My scholarship in Germany on Marx, Benjamin related figures somehow also relates to the political situation on the ground. So it didn't need to have that external trigger to do it, but then we were basically, either we withdraw from Benjamin scholarship or have to actively dissociate ourselves from that association, or we do something ourselves. And so I was actually against calling for boycotting my colleagues I had worked with for many years. So I thought, let's do something ourselves, which maybe could also function as a not only different approach to Benjamin scholarship, but also a different approach to the political and also disciplinary boundaries within our field of scholarship, and also going beyond scholarship. So in the beginning, we didn't think of let's do activism or let's do a political or scholarly conference only. No, we thought through being there, through going through these fields, we would open a different conversation that also is open to the non-specialist, of course. And there we are now with the concept of how it was done. And if as much as I'm indebted to philology, Benjamin philology, and thinking through language, otherwise there is no thinking, I thought that as text, whatever text actually, doesn't need to be Benjamin, does not speak in a vacuum, and it needs a certain circumstance or a certain dangerous moment of reading, Benjamin would have called it probably, or in a situation and a certain time and place where a text can be read in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So it could also have been a different place, in a different situation. I don't know, but for us it was this place, and we had immediately the chance to work together with Benjamin scholars in Palestine, and also with people who are in art practice, in curatorial studies, in research, artists themselves, and of course this was very, very lucky situation. So Lara, Khaldi and Yazan, Khalili, it was great that we could work together immediately.
They brought some sort of already existing context and infrastructure there in Ramallah.
Yes, especially through Lara and Yazan being at the Sakakini center. This was great, and also it was a great space for us. But without that support or this collaboration, also with Birzeit University, it would not have worked. And so for me, the most important thing was that we do not parachute an already conceptualized classic conference or seminar format to whatever place. This will be non-site and non-time specific, but rather to be good old modernists, so you have a site specificity there. And Benjamin doesn't speak to each one at each place in a similar fashion. So actually, if you are interested in philology or in the transversal relation of philology and philosophy, then you need a place that through which a time and a place through which the text can speak, can be lived through, or can be made a different thing, because the text is not a text in the book. I mean, it is a text that is to be read, and it lives on, fortleben, the text. So these were a kind of obvious insights that I shared with my friends, comrades, and colleagues when we first conceptualized it. And we left it quite open. As you remember, the call was quite open. We didn't prescribe it too much. I was against an over-curation. I was against over-theorizing or prescribing. And that brings us to the format. The format was actually more or less a seminar style, a huge seminar in the end, a close reading group. Of course, there are certain physical boundaries here. You cannot fit in too many people into one group. As you remember, we had to separate the groups at some point. Not everybody wants to read each text. There are the specialists, there are the non-specialists. We had to agree on lingua franca English, whereas we also have some Arabic translations, and many could also read a little bit at least of the German original. So, of course, we had to work ourselves through different layers of scholarship, expertise, command of English, different knowledges of different languages to share a conversation. But it was quite amazing how intense it was, and also how enthusiastic people were. And it was more thinking with and through Benjamin rather than talking about him. Of course, there were some talks that went a little bit more experimental, beyond the text itself, but I found it very important to read through Benjamin. So ironically, you may say, when I just a couple of minutes before criticized a philological approach only, in the end we appear to be much more philological than maybe other conferences who just have 3 papers, 1 moderator, everyone has 20 minutes, and then we do this classic back and forth, where it's also a little bit more of a kind of showcase of what is the status of scholarship within a certain field. It's fine, it's limited, it's also a bit boring maybe, and maybe not the format that is so productive in the case of Benjamin, maybe also not with Marx or Brecht or whoever, who maybe spoke also from outside of what was the institution of the university during their times. So this was basically one way to conceptualize it, in being close to the text and find the openings to our situation, our place and time, which were also different places from where we spoke, figuratively and also literally, in the text, to take the text as the gateway, rather than coming with our concepts and then just use the text to prove something that we had found already before, or to just do whatever signposting, or to use Benjamin for an agenda we had already formulated. To think with and through Benjamin. Of course, you find kind of concept of medium or mediacy already in Benjamin, so you didn't have to bring that much there. It was actually there.
That's what I found really fascinating about, first, like you said, the appeal that it had. It was very, very many people wanted to attend, and many traveled to Palestine.
Despite actually the very complicated border situation. Also, for some actually couldn't. Some of my Egyptian friends were denied. Some made it. But in the end, we were all surprised. I mean, you remember how many people we could gather in the end. And there was a certain spirit of also excitement, a thrill almost, that we could speak there together. And it's almost hard to remember how fast the time was running. It was only 1 week.
What for me was really fascinating also was the diversity of people that attended. You cannot really categorize those or define those as being activists or purely aesthetics or theorists or artists. It's already quite difficult to do. Yet one can say that there people have been brought up being or studied as an artist, or have grown up thinking as a theorist, or have been educated as such. In Benjamin, also in artistic circles, is an important figure, or has informed much of artistic thinking in how to deal with image, how to deal with time, how to deal with history, how to deal with historic imagery. That's what I found very fascinating, and for me that is the part maybe that I understand most, because I come from an artistic background, but seeing the people from diverse categories joining there, converging there, and around the same central figure was for me very, very telling, that those different mindsets or discourses or epistemes that people move in centered around the central figure that was Benjamin, and the reading groups. So the text became this central axis around which conversations and communications occurred.
Axis and axis, both,
yes,
actually.
Exactly.
Or you can even say the arcade through which you can walk, if you want to quote the translated essay. Interestingly, also, if you think about those people who were there, you cannot really categorize them. Of course, a figure, a person, a professor like I think Jeff Sachs, who works on translation, also on Arabic thought. He reads Arabic, he translates. He is a translator in a Benjaminian way, or tradition, I wouldn't say in Benjamin's case, but he is not a classic Benjamin scholar. Or you have someone like Susan Buck-Morss. By the way, everybody traveled on their own pockets, basically. Okay, for professors, it's easier. We didn't have any funding. Everyone came with the little money they had, or bigger money they had. Still,
I think it's significant. I mean, they
very
are professors and they are tenured, but
they took their own money and they flew into Amman and came overland. And if you think about Susan Buck-Morss, for instance, she came, and within Benjamin scholarship, of course, she is an Adorno and also Benjamin scholar. She's very well known. As you know, she worked also on the Arcades project. Her name is in there. She was in Frankfurt. She knows basically everyone there. She's very established in her field in terms of Benjamin scholarship, but she wouldn't think of herself, I think, as these classic scholars that I mentioned earlier, because in very Benjaminian fashion, she sees Benjamin maybe more as a method of thinking rather than a certain field of study that you could fix, and also it is against the disciplinary boundaries of each discipline. So that she came didn't surprise me in the end. Also knowing her now much better after in the last 5 years, and from the way how she writes, she was the ideal person to come there, and it was clear she would come. And you remember, she was in every session sitting with us until the end of the and we had many I mean, we were fighting over lines or sometimes interpretations of certain sentences. So in hindsight, this wasn't so surprising. And also if you go through all the guests who came, so they were all related to Benjamin, as you said, in different manners, but they don't come from certain categories. So even a person who's known as an artist or has an art practice, meaning when you declare your taxes, where's your income coming from, then you're an artist basically. So I mean, according to the law, but you maybe have a practice as a writer or as a reader as well, and you live in this world. So you, to a certain degree, what you do is also activism, or activism is you are actively involved, whether you want or not, at least subjected to a political economic situation, where you have to react to. And you cannot just say, I'm just doing my art, or of course not. These debates are very old. We had also years of institutional critique. We're already beyond that. So there was a diverse group coming, but the group was exactly as diverse through being related to Benjamin because of because Benjamin is so uncategorizable, or Benjamin speaks to many categories, and actually they're not really categories, they are set in motion when thinking with him and through his texts. And so in a way we didn't need to reenact this. That came actually through the call, quite organically through the call and through the people that are interested in this place.
Yes, there obviously is a need by a lot of people to escape this mold in which they inadvertently fall in some sort of sense, be it professional or be it in the field that they are working in, that sets some sort of epistemological boundaries or sets some also economic demarcations that shape life, and in which boundaries you then stay. Maybe I would like to discuss a bit about how I understand how language theory of Benjamin is particularly applicable to intertextual translations. How you might go from some sort of field of scientific inquiry to another one, and their use, or between poetry and science. But there were also a lot of artists present there, and Benjamin argues that also art can be seen as a system with a language, or which can be seen through a grammar of language.
Yes, I mean, and of course what is art is something that we don't know, because it's in flux, it's in becoming and changing. And that's why to make a sentence, a simple predicative judgment on a subject, here art, and then say art is that, art is political, art is that, would almost, already for Hegel, but definitely for Benjamin, be something nonsensical, as subject and predicate, even grammatically, are moving and changing and transforming themselves. Yes. So that's why I would even go that far and say, the moment we try to think with Benjamin and through Benjamin, or just basically when you start reading the texts and discuss them, you cannot anymore say there is method fixed, and that is the subject matter, and there is a relation between the two of applicability or non-applicability, because the application, or if you say impartability, which say with Benjamin, Mitteilbarkeit, the way of thinking through a medium that changes with your practice, in your practice, and also changes the two nodal points, if you want, subject and object. So that means we cannot say there are artists who have a well-defined field that is called art, and here's Benjamin, he comes from theory, so let's extract a method and let's apply to, this is exactly the vulgar notion of natural sciences, where the observer or the subject, in all this fantasy of being a sovereign subject, can be detached and outside of what is being inquired into. And exactly this, of course, in quantum physics you don't have that anymore, but in this vulgar sense of natural science, there is still the idea that you could actually say this is subject, this is object or subject matter, and here's a method, and this is the relation of applicability. Benjamin is clearly somebody, among others, who would deny that this relation exists. This is exactly the myth of bourgeois science. And to work against that is also thinking with Benjamin. So it's actually an exercise of, I'm not saying a methodological argument. No, it's actually of how you relate to what nowadays is called a canon of knowledge, how you are transformed, changed within it, by it, through it, but it definitely it somehow disappoints the technician who would like to have a formula to apply to a different field. That's why I would say textual work with Benjamin is also certain discipline in the double sense, which of course then becomes transdisciplinary discipline to yourself of not trying to extract something in that instrumental manner and then use it. And of course we know so many curatorial statements in the art world that, I mean, what you can almost say, if you don't have a Benjamin quote in it, it's not worth it. So we have, of course, him as this perpetuum mobile of a citation machine.
Yes.
Okay, fine, but that comes with a certain market. We don't need to talk about it. Maybe that's boring, but the expectation of finding a method, a Benjaminian method, and then apply it to other fields, it's a very dangerous one. And at the same time, I would say, and I think we showed that we will not seal him off as this kind of idiosyncratic thinker that can only be understood from within his oeuvre himself, which is anyways a changing oeuvre, because if there's no readership, there is no oeuvre. So it's changing. So it was to avoid these two extremes. One would be the flat application, let's call it Anglo-Saxon empiricist, positivist, vulgar natural science. And the other one would be, let's call it old school, if you want, German fashioned scholarship to seal off a certain corpus of knowledge and say this is only hermetically to be understood from the specialist who has to be 30 years of training. So both had to be avoided and not go for kind of a sad middle way of a little bit of this and that, to offer a third. And actually Benjamin offers that. Yes. But it was very stimulating, it opened a possibility for a different way of doing, of having an institution of reading, of practicing, of understanding reading also as a practice, as something that has to do with certain performativity of reading. And this way of relating to texts definitely stayed with us, with many of my friends. And actually just now we are thinking of a summer school in the area of Berlin, where we also put the main emphasis on reading together. Reading together also means literally the letters you speak out in the group, and you read it and discuss it, which is a very slow pace, of course, and which is exactly the opposite of this injunction or invitation to overproductivity. So,
Yes.
as you remember, that conference, I mean, now I'm calling it conference already, which it wasn't probably, let's call that meeting, didn't produce a volume, because it was actually for those people that were there, who came there, shared the memory of which, of course, actually in a way, the Nachleben, the Fortleben, or the afterlife we are just doing now also here through this conversation. But we didn't produce the regular volume that is the conference volume. It would have been a weird thing. Of course, the documentation in a way we need, and also you're also part of the documentation. I mean, without you, we would not have access to certain audiovisual material. But it wasn't organized, for instance. We didn't ask you to do this before. It came luckily all together. We have some notes. We have some articles, that's also true. People wrote about it, but it was not that we produced a definite product out of which. It was more initiating moment for some of us at least to do practice differently and to explore this further.
Yeah.
But it wasn't done as an academic conference, because that would have probably resulted in a volume, and an edited volume. And we may do something still. I mean, nobody owns that label, if I may call it. I don't do, others don't do, and those who were there also don't exploit it afterwards.
I understand this is fully in resisting conventional or the capitalist economy of production.
Yeah, and the gig economy and the logic of putting your name in the circulation. I think that would have been boring.
Yes. Still, that leaves us with the question of agency. How could this? We talked about this just before this talk. This method this way of working or approaching a meeting really stays away from the conventional economy of production that is geared towards an end, which is already phrased in the beginning and has to be mediated. Thereby, each and every time the ends and the beginnings don't meet. I understand this, but how could such a idea of production being can be made can be approached methodologically? Can it become a method?
I mean, not in the way how method could be extracted from and learned through, and then it become a formula independent of its context. I think this probably not. But as a method, or as method is detour, of course. Method asks the question of mode of presentation. Mode of presentation cannot be thought of independently of who is doing what with what material, in what place and time. So of course, yeah, the whole thing is there, but method is a certain, let's say, trajectory or perspective, which refrains from two extremes. One would be we can just use that formula for everything, like a little machine, put the content in here. The method is the grinder, and you get a certain result. Of course, this we've ruled out. The other one would be the other, let's call it the relativist flip side of that totalizing perspective, which would be over complicating. So let's gather everything, kind of a total historicization. Let's gather all materials, whatever, and give a total view. Whatever. Of course, also megalomanic, totalitarian fantasy. No, it would be a certain perspective that is not invented, but it comes obviously through those who do that. So the gravity of their thought, their desire, what they want there, because they don't know, but there is a certain angle, a certain, you can say, what is desire? It comes through passion, suffering, implication, involvement, and something you cannot avoid doing, and a certain motivation, which of course you don't have to to invent the political implication and relevance of which. You can say as a method, you could almost say the other way around. It would be, if you have to invent your course retroactively or even prescribe it, then better don't do it. If you have a course, of course you cannot spell it out, otherwise it wouldn't be a course. That's the kind of the impossibility of spelling out the object of desire, if you want. But if you have that, call it gravity, gravitational force or magnetism or whatever, then use that, because at the same time what gives you the perspective will also blind you, because that is, you cannot have the total view. A total view is anyways a fantasy. Donna Haraway may call that situated knowledges. So knowledges are anyways situated. That's why I don't refer to her here specifically, but her point is of course clear, but her point makes only sense in a myopic world, which is the world of either totalization via ultra relativism or prescribed method, as we had before, where you can extract it. But anyways, let's assume we anyways have knowledges only in situated changing conditions. Then using your perspective, which is also the one that blinds you, as your epistemological microscope or even parallactic telescope, because you will probably see one or two images that you cannot, two or three or more, that you cannot fully combine and assimilate to each other, and to work with and through these contradictions. It may result in one product that is one transitional product, and there's another one, and there's another one.
Yes.
So I'm not calling for.
There's no need for it.
But you can have, and I also am not saying there is a definite product, but again, avoiding either the prescribed product or having the bad infinity of we do it tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Again, the bad infinity, the temporality of the bad infinity of lifelong learning, for instance, one of the most totalitarian neoliberal concepts in higher education, is also to be avoided. So there must be a kind of a point where you produce something, but it's a momentary fixing of something which is in flux. And there is nothing wrong about it, and you work through the negativity of your own misunderstanding. That's probably a method that is a detouring method, but it has to allow itself the time to immerse itself into the material and to work it. I mean, this is nothing new. It's very, I would say, almost kind of old school modernist approach, but it is definitely against a discourse of managing fields of knowledge, of putting yourself ahead, or even assuming a kind of the perverse fantasy of I know the other, I know my self-othering as well, and I could totalize the entire discourse and could say this person is speaking from this perspective, this person is from the other perspective, and I can totalize that and give a kind of a tableau or a diversification table of content. You cannot, because
is that the old Hannah Arendt division at place?
No. Hannah Arendt is completely something else. I think we had a little conversation before that conversation where I was at least very skeptical about Paolo Virno's starting point in the book The Human Condition by Hannah Arendt, because I think she really didn't get the point of political economy. Marx is a critique of political economy, and the political economy also has an aesthetic part, I mean a sensuous part of it, but also had a kind of super-sensuous and a centro-super-sensuous, as we famously refer to, let's say, the symbolic dimension of economic value as a social relation. So that these, or the condition of modernity, and not condition of bad humanism always leads to these problematic notions. Let's call it a theory of modernity. Probably starts with that the economy is never economic only. There's a libidinal economy, the political economy, whatever economy, but economic economy doesn't exist. It's the first thing to understand. So that also in economy, obviously in aesthetic production, and that this is interlocked from the beginning, and it's called the social relation that is in becoming, and the social relation also has an abstract social relation within it. That's a capitalist.
I think that's precisely what Verno says in reading Arendt.
I know, but the starting. I agree with his conclusions, but the problem is that Hannah Arendt sees a problem in Marx's theory of bringing together poiesis, production basically, or reproduction of human life, together with oikonomia, the idea of the household being reproduced then on the nationwide scale, and politics.
Yes.
Politics as praxis, as a good old Greek, sitting there in the agora and discussing political matters of the citizens.
Yeah.
This is exactly the retroactive bourgeois fantasy. Modernity is where you precisely have an economic or like freedom, liberty, freedom, equality, and Bentham, as Marx said. You don't have the bourgeois civil rights that allow you to be a citizen that acts in the political sphere without the economy. You have a political economy. The economy is political.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And also the private sphere of the old oikos household is also political.
Yes.
So you cannot assume that the flaw of theory is to have mixed those fields and have them given us a sociological theory of politics, and let's liberate politics from the constraints of the social. No, it is social qua being economical, because economy is political economy. And this is something very weird in her approach, as much as I like Hannah Arendt in other of her writings. Yeah. I think it's a complete misunderstanding of a theory of modernity, and maybe here I would say I'm dogmatic and also have a certain perspective. I think if a theory of modernity starts with a disavowal of Marx, this theory will pay a lot. Look at Heidegger. I mean, for sure his wrong political allegiances are not just coincidental, even though of course I read Heidegger. I think he's one of the most interesting, relevant philosophers of 20th century, so-called Western modern continental philosophy. Absolutely true, and I read him of course, but he paid for his avoidance of understanding what is actually the ontological dimension of capitalism as a negative social abstract relation, and that he didn't get, and he paid for it. And Hannah Arendt paid a different price, but I would say if you have a theory of modernity that cannot come to terms with capitalism as a social relation, this will backfire. And of course, you can say this is a perspective, this is a dogmatic perspective maybe, but I think for a method for me, this is definitely my epistemological, you can say, what blinds me, but also at this blinding tool, or like this kind of wall that I erect here, is at the same time my parallactic telescope through which I think, read, act. Yeah. And I think also to your earlier question, what is method, to spell this out and not coming with false liberal tableau of we can do with Marx or without. No, we cannot do without of Marx. We cannot think modernity without a critique of political economy. Sorry, we cannot. No. If you want so, if you try to start with a disavowal of that, and it's no, economy is just a little small realm of human life. We have here also art, we have here also culture, religion, and nice lifestyles, and so on. If you come with this kind of compartmentalized positivist stuff, I think you are already you are then the target of a critique of ideology, and we have a discussion. It might be a productive one, but it is part of method. So of course method doesn't mean a pluralism of method. It is not an understanding of a kind of a bourgeois a department store where I can have a yogurt with 0.1 fat and 3.7 fat and the organic one, and then buy what choice is up to you. No,
Yes.
I would like to have it differently. I would like to put Marx in the archive or to deactivate his thought for my thinking, but we don't have this choice.
I think this insistence. Sorry to use the wrong phrase, absolute, because I'm not trained as a theorist. So, but I know how that is the wrong term. But let me try again. The insistence on that, I think, is very important, given also that other characteristic of our current condition is the division of labor.
Yeah.
Which requires an investment of each and every one participating in this divided up landscape of in production. This investment in this knowledge of political economy covers everything. So it depends then on each and every one how they act within this division of labor, I would say. Yeah.
And there's class struggle. So
Yeah.
I mean, Marxist feminism obviously made clear that reproductive labor, some say affective labor, but that's not all. Reproductive labor is labor should be paid for.
Mhm.
That's kind of the theft that capital organizes in a great scale. It's called primitive original accumulation, taking unpaid labor, turned it into capital. Then we have different forms of labor, intellectual labor, so-called manual labor. Think of Sonretel's book, which is an artificial definition, because we all know that also for any manual labor you need also intellectual labor.
Absolutely.
But it's just a division to create hierarchy within the labor force,
Yes.
and to give different wage to different factions of workers, or higher administrative personnel. Yeah, of course, this is class struggle, and we cannot assume that we are exempted from it only through being invested in cultural work, being an educator, or being at the university, or being a self-employed, self-entrepreneurial artist. Of course we are not. It's just a matter of awareness, but also of necessity. If your revenues come anyways because you have invested in the stock market maybe in 2008-9, and you have your money anyways, and you do critical theory as a kind of a hobby, sure, I won't convince you for a strike, because now I sound very old school, but this is important to put in to factor in objective class interest. Of course this person will not be with me. This is not somebody I can rely on if you are also not existentially invested in that. Implied. You can of course do critical theory is not charity. All these liberals who annoy us in the art world, sure, they should throw money at us, great, because we need it for other things, but they are not allies, because they are there for maybe they think they can get like some kind of critical cachet, or the foam of a beer, draft beer, and just to get this foam of the critical flavor for them to bring home, actually to maybe raise their whatever social or social capital or whatever. But this is not what we are talking about, obviously. In a way, it's related to your method question, because method also is here about an implication or an involvement or a suffering or being subjected to a situation. It's not that we choose from high up what would be the right tool for us. I mean, we're thrown in a situation where obviously class struggle is also something that is related to our labor power, and we sell our labor power and how we organize ourselves there with others, and also fight these artificial definitions, manual labor, intellectual labor. I mean, this is also class struggle in theory, you may say, with Althusser. Of course, that's important. And I see Benjamin Palestine in this context. There, of course, we came by our own money, so we had to make, some of us had to make real sacrifice, because that is still a flight ticket you have to pay. And you have to maybe sacrifice another product or whatever you may need for living. But some people thought it was important. And that was also, I'm not saying this is good, because of course I think everybody should be paid the same, or ideally there is no payment. There was a completely different form of social mediation, sure, but in this society, let's assume we need a more equal payment. And I wished that these constraints wouldn't exist, but they were there, the obstacles, and those who came made an effort. And maybe that's also a reason why nobody afterwards tried to monopolize it or make it a label or sold it to any whatever further. No one made a product out of it.
That's kind of a telling omission, actually, that it was not that much recirculated or that much.
Many collaborations were initiated there, and they live on, but they don't do it under the heading of our little gathering there 5 years ago, which is good.
Yeah,
which is totally good. And in a way, you can say, sure, I read these 2 or 3 articles that were written, but it's the first time I talk about it now for almost 4 years, I would say. That's of course my memory might be idealizing in hindsight. Maybe I also had some trouble there. For sure, the organization was not so smooth as it looks, maybe, and also in light of the very delighted atmosphere we had there and the enthusiasm. We just memorize maybe the affect and not the complications we had on site, for sure.
All the structural difficulties with it, of course, because what was that time? In reference, this is maybe the final question I would like to ask you, in reference to your text about No Future, where you spell out the transference of capitalist domination first through our times, occupation of labor time, into the spatial dimension as such, how it occupies, is transferred as capital value through a space itself. In that sense, the time of Benjamin in Palestine clearly took away from the conventional capitalist production, which established its own quality of time, maybe. But what can be said about the platform Benjamin in Palestine in a spatial dimension?
We said that site or place and time matter, and we were probably against an abstract notion of time and an abstract notion of space. Space as the abstraction of place. Unless you say, but come on, space and time are transcendental, pure forms, transcendental forms of the Kantian subject of cognition. Time and space is just the ordering principles of aesthetics. Time and space order how whatever intuition, perception is organized. Sure, if you see it as a lived experience that is related to a social relation, time and space matter and also are socially configurated. And I take this argument from Frederick Jameson. It's an older. He had this in the cultural turn of late capitalism in the early 80s. He had this theory already that the Fordist mode, the classical modernist Fordist mode of capitalism, was organized through an economy of time, and Marx has it. Also, it's the struggle over the normal working day. It is a struggle around, and also modernist avant-garde is basically something also about opening different temporalities, not different temporalities, but you could say a certain experience of time that goes beyond, let's say, the factory organized economy of time that capitalism in the experiential world has created. But we know that capitalism also organizes the very historical frame or horizon of expectation in a during a certain period of capitalist development. And his argument is that in postmodernism we have a ahistorical or dehistoricized temporal experience, which it doesn't work with a specifically historical horizon of expectation, or there's no horizon anymore. It's basically all spatialized. So this is a huge argument, and I mean I didn't really discuss his argument. It was just a small commentary saying that there's a certain model of capital reproducibility in financial capitalism, which works through the let's say speed of light, which are the fiber optical cables that organize the minimal delays that offer nowadays an income for fictitious capital as an income revenue in the stock market, and derivative sales in automatized mostly, where the problem of how to spatially represent that wealth, which obviously you can't see. You can also not see value, of course. Capital is also intangible in the aesthetic realm, sensuous, supra-sensuous, as Marx said. However, you have certain monuments of Fordistic capitalism you can refer to in your sort of post-modern architecture, but in post-modernity as an historical epoch, it more and more becomes problematic to represent capital, even though if this representation is always a false one, because you cannot represent capital as such, but nevertheless to give kind of a spatial counterpart, a kind of an aesthetics of capitalism. And there you can say that spatialization is a strategy also of dehistoricizing social struggles. If you dehistoricize social struggles, that is great, because then you only have specific, site-specific people with spatially defined characteristics, interests, identities, and so on. You can play them all against each other. There is no tradition of the oppressed. There is no proletariat or history of violence, or history of colonialism and capitalism. You don't have that anymore. It's all cut off. It's all in one space, and all the different historicities are juxtaposed in one space. The space is ideally always co-temporal. That means they can also have their own temporalities for sure, but they're ideally only through fiberglass optical delays in the same space, juxtaposed in the same second on demand. That's great, of course, for capitalism. If you cut off history, you can't do this, of course. I argue precisely that you can never get away with the negativity of history. But there are the attempts. Yeah. So I see it as spatialization, as a neoliberal capital strategy, which of course doesn't work. But of course, I do not understand Jameson in the way time is good, space is bad, so let's go back to good old modernism and do something about an economy of time, and that's divest from or reject spatialization. No, of course not. And site specificity is, of course, the modernist topos anyways, topicality, topos place. Of course, I mean, we cannot say postmodernity is space and modernity is time. Of course not. It is more of how class struggle is framed, how certain strategies of capital work, and it has to do also with means of technological reproducibility, your digital ones. We cannot think of the argument on spatialization. I take this from Aesthetics of Singularity, from a kind of recent article from Frederick Jameson, I think maybe 5 years ago. You cannot think of this without digital means of reproducibility. And by the way, the stock market exchange, the stock market trading of those temporal limits, minimal temporal limits, only works through digital automatization. Otherwise, you don't have that. The traders have to be replaced to a certain degree, at least, through an automatic algorithm. Automatic is actually not enough. It would be an algorithm that works through automatization of temporal delays, a kind of an economy of time on a micro level, that can actually give you the fantasy of an aesthetics of contemporaneity within one space, and this space is the capitalist world market, of course. You can say uneven and combined development made useful for capitalist regimes of accumulation on a global scale. This was a critique of that, and I did this for Frederick Jameson, but I didn't envision it in terms of the space of the platform Benjamin in Palestine in this conjuncture, but I thought, of course, site and time specificity, maybe then we sound very modernist or old school leftist modernist in this sense. Because then, if we think this in a postmodern sense, we could have actually extracted it and then do Benjamin Festival in what would be the next country?
Franchise traveling.
Yes, exactly. yeah. We didn't do this, of course, no.
How then to think of, you also had this analogy with Greuze's politics of installation as a way to address the reoccupation of space, or in this case then also time.
The argument in Greuze was interesting for me because it spoke somehow also to Frederick Jameson's argument on singularity, so that you would have what Benjamin called aura, something you cannot repeat, something that is only in this place, bound to one object, how one object is framed as unique, singular in this space and time. How this actually happened to space as such that you have one-off events that you cannot repeat, that the one-offness, if you want, the eventual character of that event is already something of a value that goes into a certain installation that you can, it might be site and time specific, but this specificity is sealed off or kind of dehistoricized. He calls it, I think, symbolic privatization of public space. And then you can sell this as a unique commodity to those people who participate, because every performance will be differently. So you can actually have, it's the old dream. You have a serial production, like think about Fordism, serial Taylorist Fordism, like really nicely packaged. But each commodity would be a singular commodity.
No.
Of course, we have it because every singular customer will pay for it. But every commodity, every selling of the commodity would actually change the commodity through the participation of the consumer, and so you don't have to innovate that because it was always be a different one, because you would actually sell not the commodity but you would sell the eventual the eventuality of the event of handing over the commodity, and then you can of course make it immaterial. And look, that's not far from what's going on. Of course, if you talk to PR people, they will say, I'm not selling you a car, I'm selling you the idea of Peugeot and the idea of a station wagon, because that's freedom and so on and so on. And of course then you can make it a performance, and then you can also change a little bit. You can add a pseudo cult value, Benjamin would call it a pseudo aura, and you could sell this actually on a mass scale. This would be exactly the argument that you can take from Greuze and Jameson. But I'm not saying installation art is bad. It's a symbolic privatization of public space, but I say this is some kind of, you can read it in a symptomatic way of how the singularization.
It's also not a question about good or bad, I think, but it's a continuous adaptation of artistic strategies and of ways how to answer a game